Hi, this is Huang Zhenyu, or Z, and my co-host Ken Wilcox, here for another episode of China 411. Today, we're going to talk about wine, and we're very happy to invite our special guest, Don St. Pierre, who is a wine entrepreneur in China and created one of the largest distributors of wine, fine wine, in China. Welcome, Don.
Thanks, E.
So, before we start, I'd love to just get a little bit of background of who you are and what you did.
Well, let's see, where to begin.
Tell us about your dad, for starters.
Sure, I guess that's a good entree into China. My dad was in the automobile industry for most of his life. And at one point, he had the opportunity to move from Michigan, where we were living. I was born in Canada, but we moved to Michigan when I was about 7. And we moved to Jakarta, Indonesia, and that was the beginning of our Asian adventure. He worked for American Motors, producing Jeeps, and we lived in Jakarta for 2 years. I went to high school there. Then from there we went to Japan. I graduated from high school, and he had the opportunity then to go to Beijing. So in 1985 he moved to Beijing to run Beijing Jeep, which was the first American automobile joint venture in China. And that was really where our family adventure began in China, and where my passion for China culture, history, people started to really flourish. And so I went back to the U.S. for university, but then would come back to Beijing to see my father every summer, and developed an interest in one day starting a business there. And eventually that's what we were able to do together. In '96, my dad and I started ASC Fine Wines in Beijing. And we started it without knowing much about wine, him knowing quite a bit about China, and me knowing a bit about import distribution from one of the businesses I had started in California before. So we came together and we started ASC in '96, and in '98 I moved to China full-time and lived in Shanghai, where I opened up our office there. So we essentially built the company with him being in Beijing and me being in Shanghai.
Amazing. So, as we all know, wine is really taking off in China. What is exactly the situation with wine on the ground in China?
Well, it's a complicated one right now because the austerity measures implemented by the Xi Jinping government, as well as the crackdown on corruption, has really changed the nature of the premium fine wine business, which was the area that we were most focused on. Prior to Xi taking power, a lot of the wine sales in that segment were geared towards government entertainment. So people buying wine for the purposes of building relationships with government officials. And subsequently, the wines they were buying were really recognized globally as the best wines in the world, which tended to be French. And so most of the fine wine business in China was driven by government entertainment and was focused on French wine. Over the last few years, that's changed dramatically, where now you're not seeing hardly any government entertainment because of the crackdown on corruption and austerity. And you're really seeing people buying wine for personal consumption. That's what it's become. And from a long-term perspective, that's a much more healthy environment. From a short-term perspective, it's created a lot of challenges for companies that had created a model geared towards more of government than the consumer.
Very interesting. And how are these consumers being educated about wine?
Well, for my father and I, that was a big part of what we felt we needed to do to successfully build a wine import distribution company in China. So, speaking from a personal standpoint, we put a huge effort into education and training, tastings, dinners, seminars. We were the first to bring something called Wine Spirits Education and Trust into China. We got it translated, all the different levels of the courses, and we were appointed as a program provider for this. And we did a lot of things like that.
I really want to ask you a question about American wines.
Yep.
Because, at least in my experience, and if you think I'm wrong, feel free to tell me, but during the years I was in China, whenever I went shopping for wine and would go into a wine store, it felt like and I may be exaggerating, but it felt like 60% of the shelf space was taken up by French wine. And then we had a mixture of Australian, New Zealand, and Spain and Italy. And then the American section was absolutely tiny and pretty uneven too. Some good ones and some really not so good ones. And first of all, does that correspond to your experience? Secondly, why is that? Both with respect to why is the American section so tiny, and with respect to why is the French section so big?
Yeah, it corresponds pretty closely to what we saw over the years. French value in terms of the market share, if you look at imported wine into China, French value was anywhere from 50 to 60%, volume 55 to 65%. So they were the dominant player in the export or imported fine wine business, or just wine business in general. And that was reflected in our numbers as well. 50% of what we sold was French by value, probably 55% by volume. That was not for lack of trying to sell other wines, though. We had a very large portfolio of producers from around the world. And specific to California, we had quite a large number of great producers of wine from California, both on the large premium branded side, so a brand like Beringer, to smaller family-owned wineries like Schaefer, Joseph Phelps, Stag's Leap, Cakebread. So we represented a full gambit of producers, and it was always a challenge for us. So going to why it was a challenge, and perhaps why you had such a small section of that retail space being devoted to California wine, most Chinese look at America in a very favorable light, but most Chinese don't look at America in a favorable light as it relates to food and wine.
What about local wine? I'm sure when you started, that was potentially said mostly in jest.
Yeah.
Right? The Great Walls were to be laughed at. They tasted more like grape juice than like wine. But recently, they've actually done quite well. Some of them have won international awards. What do you think? Where are they now, and where can they be 5-10 years from now?
I think in any country, the domestic, as it relates to the wine, the market of wine in that country, the domestic wine business is very important to the future health of the wine industry in that country. And I think China is no different. So I think historically, the Chinese wine industry has been dominated by the government.
Yep.
So, and that's still true to this day. If you look at the vast majority of volume being produced in China, it's being produced by government-owned or related companies. There's a few exceptions, but so I think most of the quality that you're seeing being developed out of China these days in wine is related to entrepreneurs going out and doing something on their own. You're hearing more and more about this because the international press, as it relates to wine, wants to be a champion for quality Chinese wine. They believe that they'll sell more magazines and have more people visiting their websites if they are the first to talk about who's making great wine in China. So there's almost a competition amongst the media to promote the idea that wine in China is getting better.
Interesting.
Unfortunately, on the ground, it's not happening as quickly as what we're being led to believe. And I think that's for a couple of reasons. One, I think where most of the vines have been planted so far in China, you either have a climate problem or you have a terroir, a soil problem.
Now, what about Chinese investments overseas, in Bordeaux, in Napa, acquiring vineyards, acquiring technology and expertise and know-how? Is that much, as you said, another media over coverage, or is that really happening, and how does that impact the industry?
I think it's a combination. I think Bordeaux is a very good place to look at because, according to the media, China's buying up Bordeaux. The reality is that there's been a couple hundred chateaus that have been purchased, and most of them have been lower priced chateaus. So the amount of wine that China's purchased via acquisitions of chateaus in Bordeaux is pretty small. Saying that, it's a trend that seems to be growing. Jack Ma from Alibaba has recently made an investment, and from everything we're reading, he's got more entrepreneurs following him into Bordeaux. He's just created Zhouyu Zhouhao, Zhou. So he's come up with an alternative. He's come up with not a singles day, but a wine day in China, which will be September 9th. and that undoubtedly is going to drive an enormous amount of volume
A
sales.
lot of sales. Yeah.
So I think, my perspective is that you'll see more and more interest to acquire wineries outside of China, but this is part of a general trend where Chinese are looking for safe haven for their investments. They're looking at real estate as a place to do that, as a channel to do that, and wine kind of fits into the idea of what successful entrepreneurs would think is a good investment. So I think, frankly, we're just beginning to see that trend.
So tell us a little bit about Napa, and by way of background to my question, we've here at Silicon Valley Bank over the years entertained a huge number of Chinese delegations. In the years that I was in China, we counted about 60, and that was on only a 4-year period.
Right.
Coming here, and it seemed like there was a typical pattern, at least until Xi Jinping introduced the austerity measures, and that was visit the Valley, Silicon Valley, come to Silicon Valley Bank, and then after that you either went to Napa or to Las Vegas or to both.
Right.
And we've heard so much over these past, 5, 6, 7 years about Chinese buying wineries in Napa. But is that really true, or is it just a handful?
I think it's just a handful. I think there's been very few transactions. That doesn't mean there won't be a lot more in the future. But I think that up to now, Chinese entrepreneurs have been much more comfortable going to France or going to Australia than what they have in going to the U.S. Part of it is related to the cost of acquisition. In Napa and Sonoma, it's a very expensive place to buy wineries.
Even more than France.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think that's gonna change. I think you're gonna see more and more entrepreneurs have a real interest in making investments in the wine industry in the United States.
Interesting. I have another question for you about Americans trying to sell wine in China. One of the criticisms that I have heard from Chinese in the wine industry is that the Americans don't try that hard, meaning that the French are there all the time and really working the system.
Right.
And the Americans will show up for once a year for 3 days.
Yeah.
And they don't even understand the system, so they can't work the system.
Yeah.
Is that an accurate reflection, or is that?
Well, I think, perhaps it is, because the reality is that America really hasn't needed to export its wines. And I think that's true for not only China, but for most countries. I mean, we represented some great producers in Napa and Sonoma over the years. And I was always amazed at how much attention they gave us, because they could sell everything locally, and getting on a plane, coming over, investing a week in China when we're selling such small volumes of wine, economically just doesn't make any sense. So clearly they were looking at it from a long-term perspective.
On a totally different note, can you give us a little bit of the big picture around alcohol and spirits in general in China? Meaning there is this thing called Baijiu, and then there's Huangjiu, and of course then there are other things that are imported, Scotch and whiskey in general. Tell us a little bit about what role they play and the extent to which they penetrate the Chinese market.
I think traditionally the Chinese market, as it relates to alcohol, has been driven by domestic spirits. That's been the primary driver of value and volume. And domestic spirits is primarily Baijiu, as you just referenced, which is a white sorghum-based alcohol with very high alcohol content, similar to Everclear in the United States, but is brewed and made in a way that has a very distinct taste that most foreigners don't like. This is the alcohol of choice in terms of building relationships, particularly in North and East China. And this was really the dominant alcohol in terms of I don't want to say day to day, but how people interacted with each other in terms of business. Huangjiu, as you mentioned, is a yellow alcohol. Its literal name, Huangjiu, is yellow alcohol. That's more similar to sherry, so much lower alcohol content, and is really a Shanghai, Jiangsu, Zhejiang province focused alcohol that's quite big in that area. Apart from that area, it's not all that big. The other major alcohol is beer. So beer is by far the biggest by volume in China. And China has by far the largest beer market in the world. I think that the recent acquisition by AB InBev of SAB Miller, a lot of that was driven by interest to access the China market as well as Africa. So I think Baijiu, Huangzhou, and beer are really the three dominant players. And then in the south, you had this particular interest in cognac. And cognac was really a very important part of social behavior in southern China, in that it was an alcohol that was seen at the dinner table. And everywhere outside of southern China, the only other alcohol traditionally you saw at the dinner table was baijiu or beer or Huangzhou. So cognac has a very special niche that I think started in the late 70s and pretty much stayed in that area, right? So those were traditionally what we saw, and then wine became gradually more and more important and really didn't replace, but became a viable alternative to baijiu, Huangzhou, or beer at the dinner table. And that's why I think people that really understand China and the culture are so bullish on wine, particularly red wine in the future, because it's part of what happens at the dinner table. You know, it's part of your life. And in a place like India, for example, you don't see alcohol being consumed at the dinner table. You know, that just doesn't happen, with some exceptions. But so I think, you know, wine is part of the mainstream now. And that is a very exciting thing for the future. You mentioned whiskeys. Whiskeys have really not broken into the dinner table. Whiskeys are still primarily driven by the nightlife and the karaoke, which is a very big channel, but it's really subject to fashion and trends and things like that. So that's I think a market that is going to grow, but doesn't have the legs or the opportunity that wine does.
And one other question from my side before I let Z have another crack at you, and that is, I'm curious as to what extent you felt in any way disadvantaged as an American businessman in China. And the reason I'm posing the question is because many Western, and in particular American business people, when they go to China, feel that to a certain extent they're at a disadvantage for various reasons. Some relating to culture, some relating to government regulation. And to what extent you did business in California yourself before going over to build the business with your dad in 1986. What can you tell us about that from personal experience, if at all?
You know, I think I didn't necessarily feel at a disadvantage versus other foreigners. I never felt that. I actually felt that we had an advantage because my father's experience in China and the fact that I grew up in Asia, I learned to speak Chinese. Should have learned it much better than what I did, but I could get by. So I felt like we had an advantage over most other foreigners in China in our space.
In a general sense, this is kind of a big and broad question, but it's still an important one, I think, especially for people that are intending to do business in China. And that's this relationship between, on the one hand, relationships, and on the other hand, laws and regulations.
Right.
How does that differ from the U.S., if at all, or is it pretty much the same?
Well, I've been gone from the U.S. for so long, I'm not really sure. But in terms of China, you know, the relationship, it's critical that you build your relationships with the various government agencies that are responsible for regulating your business. And this can be done through dinners and meetings. It's not done through graft. It's not done through corruption. It can be. I mean, some companies choose to do it that way. But you can also do it through just hard work, being good at what you do, showing the agencies that you are a responsible company, that if they have questions, you're a company that they can go to and ask, that you'll help them understand the environment, that you as a foreigner importing wine into China, they've got to regulate it. So there's ways to do it that can be done without violating your principles or the laws that you have to follow from the country that you're from. But the critical thing is you have to have Chinese staff, local team members that help you do this, that you can trust, and that are truly loyal and are doing things in the best interest of you and the company. That's very hard to find. It's hard to find those types of people. A lot of foreigners make the mistake that the way around that is to do a joint venture in China, because you get a local partner, and that partner is going to deal with all that stuff. That normally doesn't happen. You know, the way the local partner looks at the foreign partner is that's the shortest way to profitability, right? So instead of the venture that you've created and the customers that you're going after together, that's the business. No. The local partner looks at you as the business. So the much better way to do it is, if you can, depending on the industry that you're in, is to have your own wholly owned foreign enterprise, and then just have great local team members that are your eyes and ears and really allow you to build your relationships as you need to with the various agencies that you work with.
So there's one other I've got to get off my chest here, and that is that when you talk about relationships in China with Americans, the typical response, it would apply to me too, is, well, how's that different from America or the United States? Because we put emphasis on relationships too. In fact, I don't think there are 8,000 banks in the United States. You can't find one that won't say to you, we're a relationship-driven organization. This whole concept of relationships, is it any different in China than from the U.S., or is it really just the same thing?
Well, I guess the thing to understand is that the government in China effectively controls everything, right? So, you know, it might not be materially different in terms of having the importance of building a relationship with your regulatory agencies, but the reality is that at any moment those regulatory agencies in China can step in and take over your business. So, you know, as an entrepreneur in China, you have to realize that the party is the ultimate authority for everything. And the challenge you face is that the laws that are on the books can be interpreted in different ways. And so it's the relationship that you have, that person or people allow you to interpret the laws in a way that result in a favorable outcome for your business. Or tomorrow they may decide, no, we're not going to do that. And the result is a very non-favorable outcome for your business. So there's a lot of gray in China. And I don't think there's as much gray in the U.S. And I think clearly, you know, the government can't step in and take over your business like they can in China. So, for me, Ken, that's the difference.
Those are two pretty significant differences. Yeah, you're holding
well,
back
Ken,
here. Go ahead.
you. Crazy thing is, he actually asked exactly the same questions I wanted to ask. But we know that, you know, this path you had with your dad wasn't always smooth.
No, not
Lots
at all.
of ups and downs.
Right.
Give us a story that
Sure.
our readers can remember.
Well, I mean, I was detained for 29 days in China.
Tell us more.
Yeah, so.
What does that mean, detained?
Well, I was put in jail. I was put in jail for 29 days. And so
How'd you like the jail?
It wasn't nice at all. No beds, bathroom in the room.
Crowded?
Crowded. We had 6 people in the room, very small room. And so the way the laws work in China is that they can detain you for 30 days. And then after 30 days, they have to make a decision if they're going to press charges or not. And fortunately for us, I was released on the 29th day, but it was very difficult. And we don't really know who went after us still to this day, but most likely one of the large local competitors decided that we were becoming too strong, and went after us. And so we were accused of underdeclaring the value of the wines that we were importing, which is a very complicated thing because we were importing wine from different countries and different foreign currencies. And we're importing a lot of fine wine. So, what is the price of Chateau Lafite 1982 today versus 2 years ago? When you hedge your currencies properly, what's your cost versus someone else that's bringing it in? So it is a complicated thing, but fortunately it all ended well. And actually it served as a very important wake-up call for us because one of the things that we hadn't done enough of was to look at the regulatory agencies the same way we looked at our customers, in the sense that we needed to build those relationships. And so when I was released, I set about putting a team together that was very good at understanding the regulatory agencies that we were working with and getting them to trust us like our customers trust us.
Yeah.
And the end result was a year later, we received numerous awards within China as being, the company that the customs agencies was going to trust the most in a variety of different ways. We just built a very strong relationship, and then that really helped us drive our business. We went from 120 million to almost $200 million in sales over a 3-year period after that happened.
What's the wine industry going to look like in China 5-10 years from now? And opportunities for American wine or opportunities for Chinese wine outside of China?
Well, I think right now China is the 5th largest market for wine in the world, both I think by production and by consumption. If I'm not mistaken, the numbers may have changed last year a bit, but I can clearly see them becoming number 2 behind the United States in terms of consumption within the next 10 years.
Now, hypothetically, for an American entrepreneur who made his fortune in China, who just moved back to the U.S., if you were to get into it again, where would he see opportunity?
Well, I have gotten into it again. I've just invested in and taken over as CEO of a company called Vinfolio. And this company focuses squarely on the fine wine space, wine collectors, wine connoisseurs. I believe that there's an opportunity to create a more direct relationship between the producers of great wines and the consumers of great wines. And I think technology is going to play a very important role in that. So the company that I've invested in and taken over has both a high-tech approach and a high-touch approach. And I think ultimately that type of platform and model works well internationally as well as domestically.
So disintermediating your old business, cutting out the distributors.
Yeah, because the one thing you're absolutely right, Z. I mean, one of the many takeaways I have is that I don't want to be in the middle anymore. I would like to create a platform that facilitates the relationship between the consumer and the producer, and I think practically it makes sense to focus on the very high end where there's limited supply, and the interest is more on developing the direct consumer than the different trade channels. So that's definitely a focus for me.
Got it. Ken, any concluding thoughts?
I'd like to ask you just one final question that takes us in a slightly different direction, but just big picture. There's more and more contact taking place between China and the U.S. There's absolutely no doubt about that.
Yeah.
In terms of foreign direct investment, in terms of business people going back and forth, in terms of students going back and forth. A lot more Chinese students coming to the U.S. than there are American students going to China, but still more and more contact. And of course, familiarity usually improves relationships, not always. But beyond familiarity or lack of familiarity, from a cultural perspective, what are maybe the 2 or 3 biggest obstacles to Americans and Chinese developing healthy, mutually beneficial relationships? And you've got to be somewhat of an expert on this with all of your years in China, and I think you're married to a Chinese woman, if I'm not mistaken.
Right.
So what would you say, so kind of in closing, around challenges in that arena?
Well, I think, first America needs to understand what China was 200 years ago. And I think, it's very, Kissinger's written a book on China, and, it gives a very interesting perspective that to understand China today, you can't look at the last 100 years, the last 150 years. You need to look well before that. And when you understand what China was at that time, I think you'll understand why they feel the importance of controlling their trading lanes and having more control over their own environment. The U.S. is looking at it more of what the world was like over the last 150 years. China's looking at it more from what the world was like over the last 1,000 years, right? So I think one obstacle is that the U.S. looking at the world through the lens of the recent past. And I think it would be very beneficial for American policymakers to be able to put themselves in the shoes of the Chinese, to be more empathetic towards China and understand, just like America being a great power and it wanting to control certain elements of its surroundings, the Chinese want to do the same thing. That's one thing. I think number two, Japan. I think Japan is a major issue because I think that the Chinese see America, and to some extent the Philippines, now Vietnam, believe it or not, but America supporting these different countries against China. And I think Japan is a particular problem because of what happened between the two countries. And I think that potentially is a major flashpoint between the relationships. I don't know what the solution to that is. I understand that Japan's very important for American diplomacy in Asia and globally. But I think that America needs to understand the sensitivities between China and Japan more. And I think America needs to be more sensitive to what happened. And the Chinese need to do a better job of explaining why they feel this way. So I think that's another potential problem. But the good news is that there's so much interest amongst the Chinese people to come to the United States, and to send their kids, and they want to move here. And there's so much interest amongst U.S. producers to enter the China market, and I think the demand is going to grow and grow as China shifts from being an economy based upon infrastructure and cheap manufacturing to an economy based on consumption and service. The opportunities for American manufacturers are enormous. So I think that economically there's just enormous opportunities and benefits for going to China, and then culturally great opportunities for exchange on both sides, but particularly on the Chinese coming here. So that's...
Well, that's a very optimistic note to end on. And let me thank you for coming today. It's been really helpful, and I'm sure that our viewers also will find this conversation really, really helpful in terms of better understanding China.
Thanks, Ken.
And that's another episode for China 411. See you in the future.